Tonight we continue our series of interviews with candidates in the November election. Our guest is a Republican challenger running for Governor's Council in District 6. The district includes parts of the city and several communities north of Boston. And our guest is a Republican Party activist and a neighborhood-friendly activist in Cambridge. We'd like to welcome Vincent Dixon. Thank you very much for being with us, Vincent.
Thank you, Chris.
I know you've run for office before, but talk about your background.
Well, I actually have a small business that provides guided tours around Cambridge. We talk about the military and constitutional history as well as Harvard, and that's one of the things here. I actually know something about the history as well as the law of the Commonwealth, and I've also worked in business. I've taught ESL, tutored in a variety of other subjects as well. I have a Master's of Education. My parents homeschooled me as well. You're
running against an incumbent who has a background as a trial attorney and a prosecutor. So, well, he's a lawyer, so well, why would you be better than that?
Well, the many good lawyers in the Commonwealth, but the whole idea of these elected offices was that people who aren't necessarily lawyers would monitor the professionals. I can't possibly be a doctor unless I went to medical school, but there ought to be people who are elected, whether they be legislators or health regulators, that monitor that those professionals are doing their job. And the Governor's Council certainly can have competent lawyers there, but it shouldn't be required. As far as I know, in the law of Massachusetts, only the Attorney General is required to be a member of the bar. And these are meant to be offices that provide monitoring. And we have a legal system that is very much challenged these days.
Well, this is an incumbent. I think he's been in office for about 4 years now.
Right, that's correct.
So anything you can look at in his record to say, I would do it differently?
Oh, sure. I mean, it's not a question so much of him. You know, I mean, I've met him. He seems like a pleasant fellow, but I'm looking at a broader reform mentality. We haven't really looked at the legal system of Massachusetts in a while. I hark back to many years ago when the jury trial system in Massachusetts was thought to be really problematic. And a lawyer in Middlesex County with a client said, these jury members are nothing but peers of each other, not of the general population. And that led to Archibald Cox, the great professor, being brought in as a special master, and he designed the problem. He looked at the problem and he designed the solution we have, which is you serve in a jury, you don't have to serve again for 3 years, and there are great pools of jurors that represent the people of the community. There's a classic example of reform. Massachusetts has always been at the front of reform, and it needs to be again when you have, as the Globe has reported in April, boards and commissions and judges that have not been renewed, when you have, as a couple weeks ago was reported, that the court buildings in many cases themselves are collapsing. We really have some serious problems that need to be addressed. Not the only area of government, but when people look at law enforcement and look at judges, that intersection of law and fairness, people have a sense that the system is really challenged, and they want to have a little more fairness, and I think there's some opportunity to look at that.
Well, we do have a serious problem with Suffolk Superior Court. It's a building, and it's probably going to have to be shut down, maybe even replaced. Right. I'm sure the DA is concerned about that, judges are concerned about it, so what would a Governor's Council member do that they couldn't do?
Well, I think there's a couple things. One is that when hopefully competent individuals are selected to be judges and being reviewed by the Governor's Council, judges do have broad discretion. And I would want to see appointees that think that discretion is something that could be utilized to look at their physical facilities as well. One of the great cleanups in Boston was Paul Garrity, who saw his power of health and safety as being broad and said the legislature could be held potentially criminally responsible for the health and safety of Boston Harbor. And it led to the Mass Water Resources, and it led to a great cleanup of Boston Harbor. Those kind of powers of judges, I'd like to see an activist judge, not so much in terms of the law, but in terms of the conditions. I'd like to see stronger drug rehab, drug education. $42,000 a year by one estimate for prisoners. It seems well worthwhile to look at stronger programs in terms of saving some of those people. An interesting organization has grown out of Texas called Right on Crime. And it's an organization with many conservative leaders have basically gotten to the point where they think too much money is being spent, too many people are being sent through the regular system who really ought to be diverted into a stronger drug rehab and recovery system. where people are brought back to being functioning members of society. And I think we need to incentivize that so that people who get better education and better training are given a better opportunity to turn their lives around, because after all, everyone else pays for it if they don't.
Well, it's an idea a lot of people might like, but it sounds like this is something that the legislature does more than the
Well, they should.
Council.
But I mean, Teddy Roosevelt, who's a great Republican, the original progressive and the greatest progressive president, saw, even there was an executive position, he saw that an executive position nevertheless was, quote, a bully pulpit. And any elective office that has direct relationship, if somebody is being appointed to be a judge and we put them into a system that is in collapse in many significant areas, there's a responsibility for the people dealing with that to address the broader conditions. You shouldn't just say this is a fine potential judge and they're going to be eaten up by that system and they're going to work in a terrible workplace and they're going to have a mess of a condition. They should be able to work in safe buildings, in a legal system that is more fair. We're going to have to address some of the income inequality issues that are being talked about but still haven't really been addressed. And the legislature itself obviously has had some problems here. We know the probation and parole scandal is just one of many issues here. I'd like to see a discussion that I'm hoping to start over the next couple of years, perhaps in 3 or 4 years, to look at a 10-year term renewal process for all judges where they have to be renominated and reconfirmed. So there's a process of checking of what they're doing and perhaps how they're keeping up to snuff in terms of the education and continuing changes, the demographics, the sociology of society. I'd like to see a broader sense, perhaps in 3 or 4 years, of a commission take some of the leading, we have many fine law schools here, and get some deans together and some people representing different populations and look at an overhaul of the system in Massachusetts.
What about that renewal process? I know it's not the same as making judges run for office,
Right.
But if you have a judge who has a controversial case and the next candidate for governor is running at the same time, and the judge has to think that, if I blow this, I'm out of here. Is that something you really want?
Well, that's exactly why I've talked about a term renewal process, not having an election. Elections in many other states we know are circuses, but there has to be a 10-year point, and I think it's a pretty realistic and moderate pragmatic solution, if you will. I fancy myself as a pragmatic progressive and somebody who believes in reform, because these are kind of incremental changes. In fact, at the federal level, the president is limited to 10 years. I served on an anti-poverty agency board, and there the limit is 10 years, period, when federal funds are involved. So I think renewing it at 10 years, we have to renew our driver's licenses at 5 years, physicians have to renew their licenses at 10 years. This is something that's part of our system, that every once in a while there should be a check on the competence of professionals who, after all, have great resources at their command that affect the future course of society and individual lives.
But what about the independence that we want of judges? We want them to be accountable, maybe, but
Exactly.
do we have to make it so that they're afraid of what a particular candidate might want them to do?
Well, I don't think a judge needs to be afraid of anything if they're doing a good job. But I've had people tell me on the campaign trail that one individual told me that a judge fell asleep during their trial. And I said, well, I hope you reported them. And she said, well, they did, but they said, we know him. We're not going to do anything about it. There have been other cases where clearly, though they were judgments where fact was ignored. We know there have been a number of cases, without going into too many specifics about the many cases, where judges have basically been indifferent. And I've gone into a few courts from time to time just to see what was going on. It's kind of an interesting theater of a kind. And a lot of times people are walking away with fines for various things without any particular remediation. So I'm beginning to be concerned that courts, like a lot of other fees and regulations in Massachusetts, are functioning to generate cash rather than actual justice.
We should mention for the voters out there who might not know where these districts are these days, but which parts of Boston are in this 6th district?
All of East Boston, all of the area in Charlestown, parts of the North End, a little bit of Allston, Brighton, and a little bit of Back Bay, Beacon Hill. It's a part of what used to be the 2nd Suffolk, I think Suffolk and Middlesex district, which I had run in at one time. I have the record in 1990. I won 32% of the vote at a district with 7% Republican, was endorsed by the Boston Herald and a couple of the weekly newspapers. So some people still know who I am. and I bring, I think, a respect for the political process, and at the very least, by running, I'm giving people a choice to think about issues, perhaps provide some education, what I call civic literacy 101. Not everyone understands the Governor's Council is important, but all judges have to be ratified or rejected by the governor. I believe this governor has had 9 nominations turned back. A couple of them have been pulled back rather than being voted down. So the governor doesn't always get their choices. And an important power I'd like to see used a little bit more is the ability to deny payment warrants, which is that when certain jobs are done for the Commonwealth, if it's not been done correctly, payment can be stopped. It is a body like the House and like the Senate and even like some of our constitutional officers that does some good work, but can do a lot more.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
Republican challenger for Governor's Council in District 6, Vincent Dixon. We'll have more news in just a moment.